this computer. All right, let's talk about the component life cycle. So that could be like kind of like an abstract, like, all right, well, what the hell is a life cycle and why do components have life cycles and what are the life cycles? Like, I thought it just like it's whatever's displayed on the screen, it's displayed or not displayed, but there actually is a life cycle to each component. And there's typically three like life cycles that can occur inside of a component. And the first one is initially when it's mounted to the DOM. So right when it appears to the DOM, the first time it's mounted, that is that's part of a component lifecycle. So when it's mounted, and then the second one would be if there's any data within the component, such as state or props, if any of that data changes, so the data within the component changes, that is another part of the life cycle. So like when the component updates its data. So that can be another trigger to the life cycle. And the last one is when it's unmounted, when it gets deleted from the DOM, when there's nothing, when that component no longer is being displayed. Any questions on that? So here with regards to a component's life cycle, I kind of just covered this. So mounting, when a component renders to the DOM for the first time, the document object model, when a component changes state or props data, when the component may or may not re-render. So it may trigger a re-render. And then unmounting, when the component is removed from the DOM. So let's actually go ahead. So I created just a basic scaffolding of using the Create React app. I already installed it and everything, so you all didn't have to wait. There's, that for everything to install. So here it is. I'm just going to go ahead and delete all of this stuff initially. I'm just going to say H1. All right. So if we take React back, a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, probably like 4 years ago, when everything was class-based components and functional-based components. I've mentioned before, back in the day with old React, the only type of component that can create state or have some actual state in there in the component is within class-based components. So I'm just going to refactor this to a class-based component. Just bring it all the way back to the old React days. So from React or import, I guess I don't even need that. All right. So here we have a component just called Lifecycle, or a component called app. It's a class-based component. And again, class-based components, there are certain points in the component that trigger. In OOP, what's the first method that gets executed in Python in a class?
The dunder init.
Correct. Yeah. So it's the dunder init method that gets executed in Python's in a Python class. So what's the equivalent to that in JavaScript or in JavaScript?
Constructor.
Yeah. So I'm going to create a constructor method. And I'm just going to console log constructor. So if I come over here, see if I get an error. I think I need to pass in props. There we go. All right. Whoa, what do we got here? Drive. app.js line 6. If I do a refresh, okay, there we go. So yeah, I'm going to get rid of this strict mode because I don't want that. All right, cool. So as you can see right here, constructor initially, right when this app component is rendered, it comes into the constructor and runs the constructor. And the last thing it will execute is the render method. So if I refresh, I get the constructor and the render method. But there are 3 different lifecycle methods within a class-based component that exist. So these might be outdated. Component did mount, component did update. Let's see, some of them might be deprecated. So before we use functional based or function components, we had multiple different methods, lifecycle methods that would automatically execute at different points within the component's lifecycle. So if this is an old one, let's actually go to the actual React lifecycle methods. If I come over here, let's take a look where to go. There should be. There we go. This nice diagram. So here are the different lifecycle methods that get rendered. So right when a component mounts, it runs through the constructor, then the render, and then it runs the component did mount lifecycle method. So if I come over here and I create this component did mount, I can just console log mounted. And if I come over here, if I rerun that constructor, then the render, and then the 3 lifecycle methods mounted is executed. And then we have a component did update lifecycle method. And it's essentially returns a Boolean value that determines whether or not the component should re-render. So component did update can take in 3 attributes. I'm not sure what snapshot is. I think it just takes a snapshot of the current state or something. So let's take a look at what that does. So component did update. So let's actually console log updated. But it's also console log prev props, previous state. Yep. We can also, I guess, do snapshot. So the reason why it takes in previous props and previous state is because you can compare the previous state and props with the current props in the current state and determine whether or not the component should update. So notice how component did update didn't do anything because we didn't do anything to trigger this component to actually update. We didn't change any values. We didn't change any state or anything like that. And the last one is component will unmount. There are some other ones, so show less common ones. So get derived state from props, get snapshot before update. So those are some other ones, and there are some deprecated ones as well, which I kind of showed previously. Should component update. Yeah, there we go. Get snapshot before update. These are all life cycle, but so let's actually do component will, or which one was what was the last one? Will unmount. And where does component will unmount? So if I click on that, does that take in any props? No, it does not. Component or console log unmounted. So let's actually try to get these all to trigger. So we've got constructor, render, and mounted. So component did update. Let's go ahead and actually, I'm going to go ahead and create a components and a child.js. React. There we go. I got a class-based component. I'm going to actually move all of these over to the child, like so. All right. I'm just going to call this H1 child component. And in my app.js, I'm going to import child component. Like so. All right. So if I refresh, I get the render. Well, let's actually get rid of this render. Oh, wait, no. Let's get rid of that render. So my app.js class-based component, I don't have anything. I just have everything in my child component. Because what I'm going to do, I'm going to have a button here in the parent component. And when I click it, I want it to remove the child component from the DOM. What questions do you have so far about the lifecycle components? Oh, all right. So in the class or in that parent component, I'm going to create is mounted. And I'm going to initially set this to true. And in here, I'm going to have some conditional rendering. I'm going to say this.state.is mounted. So if is mounted is true, then it's going to show the child component. Then down here, I'm going to create a button that says toggle child component. And I'm going to create a function, toggle is mounted. That is going to call this or this dot set state. This dot is mounted is the opposite of this dot state dot is mounted. There we go. So this toggle is mounted is a function that just iterates between or switches between toggles true and false. So it's going to change that. So on click, it's going to toggle this dot toggle is mounted. So if I re-render, the initial value of is mounted is true. So this is true. So it renders the child component. And when I click this toggle button, it's going to set is mounted to false, which is then going to set this to false, which is, so if this is false, then the child component will not render. What questions do you have about that logic? All right. So notice in the child component on line 6, 25, and 10, we're rendering or we're console logging the constructor. when the render method is called and when the component did mount. Oh, should just called. There we go. That might be a little bit better. All right. So now when I toggle this, what lifecycle methods do you think are going to execute when I click that button?
The update.
So the component did update.
Yes.
Okay. Does anybody else have any guesses?
I'd assume it's going to call the will unmount also.
So the component did update and the component will unmount.
That would be my guess. If I understand what unmounting is, you're removing it from the page. So
Okay. Anybody else?
I think it's going to unmount and then update.
And then update.
Yeah.
So I've got one component did update, one component did update, and then component will unmount, and then one component will unmount and component did update. Well, let's figure out. So if I click that, component will unmount is triggered. So how do we get, why didn't component did update run?
I would say it didn't need to re-render anything else other than taking that off the page. So there was no other need for any updates to be called.
Yep. Yeah, let's take a look at the component did update prop. So component is invoked immediately after updating occurs. So this method is not called for the initial render. So let's see. So let's try to get this to actually render. So component did update. We can actually, let's pass in some props in here. Let's actually just pass is mounted in here. This dot state dot is mounted. Because when we call, well, we actually might run into some issues. Not issues, but we may never get to this point if it gets unmounted before it updates. So let's just see what happens. So if I click it, yep. So the component will unmount is called before we pass in props. But let's actually get rid of that. So have it always be showing the is mounted. And let's try to get that to render. All right. Oop. Let's do a refresh. So before, the reason why component did update was not showing up at all is because I was unmounting the component before, essentially, before this props was ever passed into the child component. So this was never updated inside the child component because the child component was removed, was unmounted before this could trigger. So it essentially didn't do anything. But now, since I'm always going to be showing the child component, when I toggle is mounted, we're passing props in the child component, and we're passing the is mounted value in the child component. So whenever we change this value, the value is also changed in the child component. So the component changed. There's some value within the component change, whether it's props or state, may have changed. So if I refresh and then toggle child component, it runs the render of the child component. Then component did update. So it triggered a re-render, props changed, so it triggered a re-render, and component did update, got called, and the previous props was is mounted is true. So now is mounted is true. And we got no previous state and no snapshot. So let's just get rid of that snapshot because we don't need that. And we don't have any state. So state is null. So the previous props is true. And then when we click toggle mount, now is mounted as false. But the previous props, so the current props is mounted is false now, but the previous props is mounted as true. So that's why is mounted as true is previous props. But we can also console log the current props, this dot props. Let's just comment out previous state because this doesn't have any state. So I'll actually just so it's a little more visible. Current. There we go. So when I click that, we got render, component did update. The previous props is mounted as true. The current props is mounted as false. So what can we do with that? And we also have previous state and current state. So we can do something with that as well. Can anybody think of an example of like what we can do in component did update with this information?
Conditional rendering.
We can do conditional rendering when you, in regards to what?
I mean, I was thinking about, you're not using previous state right now. You could say that as a, I guess you could save it and pass it to something else.
Okay.
I don't know.
But so like an example would be like, all right, if you have some state variable changes, it might trigger something else to occur. So in this example, so if this props.user ID does not equal the previous user ID, grab some data with regards to the new user ID. So you can trigger, API calls if some prop data changes, such as maybe like if you had like what page number you're on, page 1, and then such as button next page on click next page. Or next item. All right, so I'm going to create a function called next item. Then I'm just going to increase all right. So I've got like the page number. And now if I do pass in page equals this dot state dot page. I can go back here. I can click next item. So previous props is mounted as true. Page is 1. Current props is mounted as true. Page is now 2. So in here I can say like, hey, if previous dot props dot page does not equal this dot props dot page. Console log, go to the next page. So we can click that, and now it would go to the next page or display some other item. And we can actually do something like that. I'm just gonna keep that there. Let's actually figure out how we can actually grab something. Let's get some console JSON placeholder. Post 1. Post 2. All right. So fetch. Oh, no, that's Python. This dot props dot page. Don't worry about what's going on here. Let's see if this works. See if I can get something. All right. So what is happening here is when I click the next page, the previous props page number is 1, the next page is 2, and now I'm initially going and grabbing post number 2 from this JSON placeholder. So let's actually get something to display on the screen. So in the component did mount, this is where a lot of your API requests will go out. So once the component is mounted, then you would initiate an API request. So what I'm going to do is initially this dot state dot data and data dot title. All right. Uh-oh. Getting an error, cannot read properties null of reading data. All right. Cool. All right. So initially, why did that work? Let's see what's going on. So log this dot state. response.data. Let's get rid of that. Just want to see if I can get something to show up. So there it is, but we want posts. This dot set state. Data equals JSON.
I think if you had parentheses on line 25 after response.json, I think that'll cause it to fire on what you already have.
Say that again. Hold on.
On line 25, response.json, I think if you put parentheses after that, the second line of, sorry, line 26, I think if you add parentheses, that'll cause that to actually run.
There we go. And there we go. There we go. Okay. So what is happening on when the component initially mounts, it's running through this, it's going to an API, it's grabbing some data, and I'm setting state to that data. So what is it? Post data. Like so. And then when I click next item on the app.js, so I click next item, it increases the page to page 2. Page 2 is up here at this dot state. I'm passing that down as a prop. And then it's running through the component did update because props has changed. So I'm doing an if statement. So I've got previous props and previous state being passed in. I'm saying, hey, if the previous props page value does not equal the current props page value, then go ahead and grab more data, move on to the next post. So I can say like, this is post data. Like so. And now I can just go next item and I grab the next title, grab the next title. And so every time I click next, it's running through. Let's get rid of that. Next item, next item. So every time I click that, it's running the render component. It's going through the component did update. So component did update. I'm showing the previous props and the current props. So page 3 and page 4, those are different. So I have an if statement. If those are different, then go grab more the data at the next page. And then, so it's grabbing that data and then it updates state again. So now state has changed. So current props. So then it triggered another re-render. Render component did update. Previous props is mounted true. Page 4 and the current props is mounted true in page 4 because the props hasn't changed. The only thing that changed there is state. So you can also say like, hey, if this dot state dot data does not equal the new state, the previous state data, previous state dot data, then do something. So you can leverage that as well. So if I wanted a console log previous state and current state, previous state, current state, this dot state, I can also bring that up there. So now component did update. So I've got two re-renders there because it initially mounted and then state got updated and the component did update. I'll go ahead and just console log component did update or component did mount. So constructor render component did mount. This is executed. I grabbed some data from an API. I updated state. So then it ran that re-render again. And then it goes into the component did update because state changed. Let me printing the previous props, the current props, and the previous state where data is null. And then the current state where data is this body ID and user ID. Now, if I click next item, it's going to do this pretty much the same thing, except it's not going to go through the component did mount part of it. It'll just run the component did update is mounted. The previous props is page 1. The current props is page 2. Previous state is this user ID with an ID of 1. The new state is still the same. I should have put these down here. So we have more like that. So current state there. It's still the same. Oh yeah. So now here, this is where previous state is ID of 1 and now ID of 2. And you keep going. Any questions on component lifecycle methods? No. So all these component lifecycle methods. So here's that's an old one. So I should get rid of that component did update, but that still does exist. But this old component lifecycle method just returned a Boolean value, true or false, whether or not the component should update. But now all those component lifecycle methods have been, since we're using functional based components now, they all use the useEffect hook. So we can replace all these component did update, component will unmount with the useEffect hook. And I'll show you how to do that after this or after the break.